Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 48 minutes before a Black Hawk helicopter would land in his parking lot and end his career. Cedar Creek Medical in Atlanta hums with fluorescent lights and the sharp bite of antiseptic that never quite masks the underlying smell of industrial bleach and stale coffee. Natalie Hayes moves through her first week on night shift like a ghost, hands steady on 4 lines, shoulders set at perfect military attention even when she thinks nobody is watching. She wears standard Navy scrubs, standard name badge, standard posture, the uniform of invisibility. But her movements tell a different story. There is no wasted motion. Her hands move like a surgeon's hands, precise and economical. When she checks a medication dosage, she doesn't glance and move on. She reads the label. Writes it down. Checks it again. The second time is slower than the first, her jaw tight like she is translating something in a foreign language only she understands. Supply orders get the same treatment. Yesterday she questioned why Dr. Whitfield ordered 6 units of cardiac bypass tubing when the protocol called for 2. Just stocking up, he told her, voice flat as a knife edge. She nodded and moved on, but her eyes lingered on the paperwork. Nobody else questions the orders. In the supply closet between rounds, Natalie pulls something from the pocket of her scrub pants. A military challenge coin, tarnished almost black, worn smooth by hundreds of hands that have passed it before hers. The edges catch what little light filters through the crack in the closet door. She runs her thumb over the worn surface, feeling for the raised insignia, the mark of someone she used to be, in a life that ended 3 years ago in a classified operation in Marja that the Pentagon has officially declared never happened. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. That name exists in no database anymore. That rank belongs to a ghost. Footsteps approach. She hides the coin away in her pocket, the motion automatic as breathing, and steps back into the fluorescent-lit corridor like she has never been anything but a night shift nurse at Cedar Creek Medical. The scar along her left forearm, pale and thin, usually covered by her sleeve, stays hidden. Everything about her stays hidden. Dr. Marcus Whitfield watches her from the hallway with eyes that calculate like a man counting money. He leans against the wall outside the trauma bay, arms crossed, observing how she double-checks the medication orders against the pharmacy printout. How she questions the billing codes. How her eyes move across a patient chart like she is not just reading it but decoding it, looking for something underneath the words. He knows exactly what she is looking for. The insurance fraud scheme he has built with 2 board members over 4 years is intricate as clockwork and profitable as a small nation. Inflated billing codes. Phantom procedures ordered and billed but never performed. Supply orders that appear legitimate on paper but funnel kickbacks into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The money flows quiet and steady, $500,000 per quarter, his personal take after the board members receive their shares. He has a wife in Buckhead with a taste for Brazilian diamonds. He has a vacation home in Kiowa Island. He has orchestrated his entire life around this money, and this quiet nurse with steady hands and observant eyes is threatening the careful architecture of it all. She checks things twice. She asks questions. She notices when the numbers do not add up. In the administrative wing on the 4th floor, Whitfield sits at his desk and makes a phone call. The number is private, a direct line he has memorized. His colleague answers on the second ring, one of the board members, a man named Conrad Sterling who oversees hospital acquisitions and has connections in 3 states. "We have a problem," Whitfield says quietly. The conversation takes 4 minutes. The problem is named. The solution is discussed. The phone call ends. Whitfield hangs up and opens his laptop, checking the balance of his offshore account, $2.3 million accumulated over 4 years of careful theft. The money is real. The hospital is just the source. Thursday morning in the cafeteria, Natalie sits alone at a corner table with a tray of eggs and toast and black coffee. The cafeteria is loud with the sounds of the day shift arriving, voices overlapping, trays clattering, the institutional smell of mass-produced breakfast food mixing with sweat and cologne. She eats mechanically, cutting the eggs into small pieces, moving through the motions. Her eyes are somewhere else. Her hands are steady, but her attention is elsewhere, still in the supply room, still on the challenge coin, still in Marja with a unit that no longer officially exists. She does not see Whitfield approach until he is standing directly beside her table. "The quiet one," he says to two residents flanking him like satellites. They are young doctors, eager to laugh at the right moment, competing for his approval the way residents always do. "I'll give her 3 more days. Tops." Natalie's fork pauses halfway to her mouth. She does not look up. "Money on it?" one of the residents asks, grinning. The question is offered with the casual cruelty of people who have never had to earn respect through anything but the letters after their names. 50 says she walks by Monday, Whitfield says. She can't cut it. Too soft. Can't handle the pressure. Natalie sets her fork down. Her hands do not shake. Her face does not color. She does not look at him, but something in her posture changes, subtle as a camera shifting focus, but the change is absolute. "You hear me, sweetheart?" Whitfield's voice drops lower, more intimate, the kind of voice predators use. He reaches down and sweeps her breakfast tray off the table with the back of his hand. It clatters against the linoleum floor with a sound like gunshots in the sudden silence. The cafeteria noise stops. The voices die. All eyes turn. Eggs spread across the tile. Toast lands butter side down. Coffee pools and spreads like blood. He tosses a patient chart at her feet, the papers scattering. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Show me you can handle simple tasks." Natalie kneels. She does not hesitate. She does not tremble. She does not speak. Her jaw tightens for exactly 1 second, a hairline fracture in her composure, and then she is on her knees, gathering the mess with the methodical precision of someone who has cleaned far worse from far darker places. Eggs. Toast. Coffee-soaked napkins. She collects them all. Her hands move without shaking. Her breathing remains steady. She is a woman performing a domestic task in front of an audience, nothing more. But her hands tell a different story. The hands gathering the food are hands that have held pressure dressings against chest wounds while helicopter rotors beat overhead. Hands that have started fours in moving vehicles under fire. Hands that have held the spine of a young ensign steady while his abdomen was being sutured by a medic who was screaming because half the unit was already dead. Those hands do not shake for breakfast trays. She picks up the last pieces and stands, holding the mess. Whitfield is smiling now, the smile of a man who has successfully broken something he wanted to break. The residents are laughing, the kind of laughter that echoes through cafeterias everywhere when someone small has been made smaller. The room goes back to its noise. Between shifts, Natalie sits alone in the supply closet. The door is locked. The light is off. She sits on an empty plastic crate in the darkness and pulls the tarnished challenge coin from her pocket. Her hands finally shake, not from fear but from the effort of holding still for so long, the trembling of muscles held at parade rest for longer than they can endure. The coin catches what little light comes through the crack in the door. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. That name inscribed in raised letters on the metal. That rank earned over 12 years of deployments to places the government says she was never stationed. She runs her thumb over the insignia and thinks about what a lieutenant colonel told her 3 years ago, the day they classified her out of existence. The operation in Marja was never authorized. The unit's actions would compromise national security if they became public. Master Chief Petty Officer Hayes would cease to exist in any official capacity. She would retain her pension, held in an untraceable account. She would be given a new identity, one that would hold no record of her service, no military email, no connections to anyone in the chain of command. She would become a civilian. She would become invisible. She thought that would be easier. The trembling in her hand slowly stills. Her breathing returns to its baseline. She sits in the darkness of the supply closet and holds a piece of metal that proves to nobody but herself that she has ever been anything but a nurse. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it was working. Nobody at Cedar Creek Medical suspected a thing. Dr. Whitfield saw what everyone saw, a quiet nurse. A careful nurse. A nurse who was going to break under pressure because all the soft ones did. He had no idea that she had survived worse than him on her worst day. He had no idea that the woman kneeling to pick up his breakfast tray had once coordinated medical response for 36 hours straight while mortars landed close enough that the impacts registered in her chest cavity. He had no idea who he was standing next to. And as Natalie sat in the darkness with the challenge coin in her palm, she heard the first sound of what would change everything, a faint beeping from her locker in the nurse's station, a phone registering a text message from a number she had not heard from in 3 years. A Pentagon number. A message with only 5 words, "We need to talk. Come home." 2 nights later, Saturday night, the cafeteria was a stage and Dr. Whitfield was conducting an orchestra of humiliation. He stood at the coffee station at 6:36 a.m., voice pitched to carry across every table, every listening ear. 2 residents flanked him like disciples. $20, Whitfield said, wrapping a $5 bill around his index finger. Says the quiet one doesn't make it through the week. These military wannabes always crack. They think discipline means something here. It doesn't. Laughter rippled outward like concentric circles in still water. A medical assistant giggled. A nurse he'd broken the previous year smiled along. The sound made Natalie's hands pause for exactly 1 second as she arranged breakfast items on her tray: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. Just fuel. Just another shift before the world moved on. Whitfield's timing was surgical. He waited until she was lifting her fork, until the tray was balanced on her right hip, until muscle memory had made her vulnerable by making her comfortable. Then he walked past her table with the casual momentum of a man who'd calculated every step. His elbow, not quite an accident, not quite deliberate, caught the corner of her tray. The plate flipped. Eggs scattered across linoleum like shrapnel. Syrup spread in a sticky pool, still steaming. A fork clattered. The room went dead silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every fork froze mid-bite. Whitfield stood over the wreckage he'd created and smiled. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. "Clumsy." He tossed a patient chart at her feet, the papers fanning across the syrup. "Pick that up, sweetheart. And when you're done playing janitor, maybe you can explain why you're second-guessing my supply orders." His eyes glinted with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally seen his prey flinch. But Natalie didn't flinch. Her jaw clenched for exactly 1 second. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint. Then her face reset to the blankness of someone accustomed to pressure, to judgment, to survival in environments that made cafeterias look like safe rooms. She knelt without expression, gathering scattered utensils with hands that didn't shake. The fork. The knife. Napkin soaked through with syrup. A medical student whispered something to his neighbor. Whitfield watched from above, waiting for something, a tremor in her voice, a crack in her composure, proof that his power was real. Natalie rose smoothly, trash balanced in her palms, and met his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Yes, doctor," she said quietly. Just those 3 words. No apology. No excuse. No anger. Just acknowledgement of the hierarchy he'd spent his career reinforcing. Whitfield leaned down, voice low enough that only she could hear but high enough that the room stayed silent to listen. "I've terminated 3 nurses this year for being too smart for their own good. Don't be the 4th. She continued cleaning, eyes down, as conversation slowly resumed around her, the cafeteria's nervous system restarting like a body returning to consciousness. Natalie disposed of the trash in a bin near the kitchen, wiped her hands on a paper towel with the precision of someone performing a ritual, and walked back through the dining area with her shoulders level and her stride measured. Later, in the empty supply closet on the 2nd floor, she sat on an overturned bucket among plastic for bags and antiseptic bottles, staring at the challenge coin in her palm. The metal was tarnished, worn from years of a hand closing around it, from midnight deployments and safe rooms and moments of absolute clarity about what she'd been willing to sacrifice. The inscription on one side, faded but still visible, read only Reaper 6. The other side showed an insignia that belonged to a unit that technically didn't exist anymore, not since the operation in Marja, not since the IED strike that killed Officer Brackle and 3 others, not since she'd held the unit together for 36 hours under fire while medevac helicopters were grounded by dust storms. Her hands didn't shake. Her face showed nothing. But she sat in that supply closet for 11 minutes before returning to her rounds, running her thumb over the coin's-worn edge like it was a tether to someone she used to be. That afternoon, Whitfield cornered her at the nurses' station in front of 4 staff members, a medical assistant, 2 younger nurses, and a pharmacy tech. His technique had evolved from crude to strategic. No public humiliation this time. This was something more dangerous, a performance of authority designed to poison her credibility incrementally. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice a warm drawl that made the word into an instrument, "when I order 50 units of fentanyl, I don't need you playing detective with the pharmacy logs. Stick to bedpans." A medical assistant giggled, the sound nervous, the laughter of someone unsure whether they were watching a joke or a crucifixion. The pharmacy tech looked away. One of the younger nurses made a point of studying her computer screen. Natalie nodded once, a small motion of acknowledgement, and walked away. Her stride never faltered. She didn't respond. She didn't defend herself. She simply left, and that combination, the refusal to break, the refusal to fight, the refusal to give him even the satisfaction of her anger, somehow made Whitfield's jaw tighten more than any confrontation would have. But Whitfield was already calculating. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stepped into a nearby office, closing the door. 3 board members had his personal number. 2 of them owed him favors from contracts he'd steered toward hospitals where they held financial interests. The other one was motivated by different fears, the knowledge of his own involvement in the billing schemes, the offshore accounts, the phantom procedures that had generated $847,000 in fraudulent claims over 18 months. He dialed the first number. "We have a problem," he said when the board member answered. "The new night shift nurse. She's asking questions about supply orders. Questioning medications. If this gets to administration, if it gets to the state nursing board." He let the threat hang unfinished. The board member's breathing changed on the other end of the line. They understood each other perfectly. They always had. Saturday night came with the weight of inevitability. The sky above Atlanta was low and gray, the kind of atmosphere that felt like it was pressing down on the city's ER departments, funneling chaos towards Cedar Creek Medical like water down a drain. At 11:36 p.m., ambulance sirens wailed outside the automatic doors, their pitch escalating then fading as paramedics cut the engines. The bay doors burst open. Paramedics wheeled a gurney through the entrance, moving with the controlled urgency of people who'd practiced this 1,000 times. The patient was a man in his 40s, civilian clothes soaked with blood that was still darkening, his breathing shallow and labored. Military dog tags swung from his neck, catching the fluorescent light, Major Eric Costillanos, Special Forces, a name that meant everything to some people and nothing to everyone else. GSW, sucking chest wound, BP dropping, the lead paramedic called out, his voice clipped and professional. ETA to the OR is 6 minutes. He's been down for 14 minutes since the wound. O2 sat is 91 and falling. Natalie moved to the gurney, her assessment instantaneous and complete, distended jugular veins, that specific shallow breathing pattern, the pallor that came from pericardial tamponade. A patient drowning in his own blood from a wound that wasn't even visible until you knew what you were looking for. Dr. Whitfield appeared, annoyed at being called in, his white coat still buttoned despite the late hour. "Prep him for the attending surgeon, nurse," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ritual dismissal. "Don't touch anything. We'll handle it." But the major's vitals were crashing. The monitor showed it clearly, heart rate 142 and tachycardic, blood pressure 70/40 and dropping, O2 sat 89 and falling. The attending surgeon was still 8 minutes away. The major had maybe 3 minutes before his heart would stop completely, before the blood pooling around his heart would become a pressure so massive that the organ couldn't beat against it anymore. Natalie moved to the bedside, her voice level and certain. He needs a pericardiocentesis now or he'll code in 3 minutes. Whitfield's face darkened, his voice becoming sharp and territorial. You're not authorized. She was already positioning the needle, her hands moving on their own because muscle memory was more powerful than hierarchy. A 14-gauge angiocath needle, the angle of insertion precise, just below the xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle, aiming toward the left shoulder, threading the needle with the kind of practiced confidence that only came from doing this under fire, from saving people when the alternative was death and darkness and the weight of their bodies in your arms. She'd done this in Marja with nothing but a headlamp and the howl of incoming rounds and the knowledge that if she didn't get this right, a 22-year-old Marine from Sacramento would die. She could do it in a pristine ER. A veteran working hospital security stood near the trauma bay entrance, former Marine Sergeant Marcus Davis, someone who'd spent for years in Kandahar and recognized the language of survival when he saw it. He watched Natalie's hands as she anchored the needle with her left palm, as she advanced the syringe with her right, as her entire body settled into the specific geometry of someone who'd performed this exact procedure hundreds of times in conditions far worse than this. His eyes widened. Jesus, he whispered to himself, the word coming out like a prayer or a revelation. I know that needle angle. That's not nursing school. That's not textbook. He stepped closer, his voice lower. You're a combat medic. It wasn't a question. Natalie didn't answer. She withdrew the syringe, and bloody fluid, pericardial effusion, the accumulated blood that had been suffocating the Major's heart, filled the chamber. Immediate relief. The Major's vitals stabilized on the monitor almost instantly. Heart rate dropping to 118. Blood pressure rising to 94/58. O2 sat climbing, 89, 92, 95. The hiss of air escaping, the metaphorical pressure lifting off a room where seconds before, death had been calculating its victory. Whitfield's face darkened with rage, not because the patient had been saved, but because Natalie had saved him without authorization, had demonstrated competence and judgment and the kind of decision-making that belonged to someone with experience far beyond night shift nursing at a regional trauma center. You just performed an unauthorized procedure, Whitfield said, his voice low and venomous. That's grounds for immediate termination. Natalie met his eyes with the calm of someone who'd faced far worse than a hospital administrator's anger. He'd be dead, she said simply. The surgical team arrived, rushing in like a change in wind direction, and they wheeled the Major toward the elevator and the OR beyond. Whitfield pulled out his phone and walked into the hallway, already dialing. The surgical team disappeared through the elevator doors, and Natalie stood motionless in the ER corridor, watching the metal barriers slide shut with a hydraulic hiss. The Major's stretcher was gone. His blood-soaked trauma gown was gone. The urgent voices and the organized chaos were gone. What remained was fluorescent silence and a single surgical glove lying inside out on the tile floor like a shed skin. She picked it up. Disposed of it properly. Then she moved. The trauma coordinator's station became her command center. A space the size of a supply closet, lined with monitors displaying real-time updates from the OR above, vital signs streaming across screens like a nervous system made visible. Heart rate climbing back toward normal range. Oxygen saturation stabilizing. Blood pressure responding to the massive transfusion protocol she'd initiated downstairs. The surgeons had the patient now, but the pipeline that kept him alive, every drop of blood, every unit of plasma, every medication pushed through those lines, that was hers to orchestrate. Natalie pulled up the Major's labs on the digital display. Hemoglobin dropping to 6.2 despite 2 units of packed red blood cells. Coagulation studies showing his clotting factors depleting faster than they could be replaced. Lactate elevated at 4.8, his tissues screaming they weren't getting oxygen, that his body was running on empty. She'd seen this pattern before. In Marja. In the field hospital set up in a warehouse after the IED strike that had killed their commanding officer. The difference was she'd had half the equipment she had now, and somehow, against mathematics and physiology and the weight of 7 casualties, 4 of them had walked out. She reached for the phone. Blood bank extension. A woman's voice answered before the first ring finished, already knowing who was calling. Natalie's reputation in a single fact: she called before she needed to, never after. I need 6 more units packed red. 3 FFP. 2 Creo units. Standing order, start running them up now. Jesus, how much is this guy losing? More than we replaced. He'll need more. The blood bank tech didn't argue. Didn't ask questions. Hung up and started moving. This was what separated competence from theater, when people who knew what they were doing just did it, no dialogue required. Natalie's eyes remained locked on the monitor above her desk. The surgical field camera showed Dr. Chen, the trauma surgeon, working with the focused precision of someone who'd performed this exact sequence 500 times. His gloved hands moved like machines executing code. Suctioning. Identifying. Repairing. The chest cavity was a landscape of damage. The pericardium had already started to scar in the hours since the initial injury, inflammation spreading like wildfire through tissues that weren't designed to burn. What she'd done downstairs had bought him this. The needle. The relief of pressure. The chance to reach this table alive instead of arriving as a body requiring paperwork instead of surgery. A surgical resident's voice crackled through the communication system. We need more crystalloid. Type and Cross just ordered another round of products. Natalie was already on the line with 4 services. You have the standing order. Every unit they ask for, no delays. I'm tracking from down here. Push it through. The resident came back, copy. Fluids running wide open. She leaned back in the chair and felt, for the first time in 4 hours, the weight of exhaustion trying to claim her shoulders. She pushed it away. The shift didn't end until 7 a.m. She would stay longer if needed. Surgery this complex sometimes ran until noon, sometimes longer. Natalie had learned in Helmand Province that time was abstract. What mattered was staying present until the mission was complete or you were dead. This hospital didn't understand that distinction yet. Whitfield walked past the coordinator's station once, around hour 5 of the surgery. He slowed, reading the vital sign displays over Natalie's shoulder. Saw the upward trajectory of the major's recovery. Saw the coordination she'd created, units of blood arriving on schedule, lab values being monitored and acted upon before they could become crisis points, every resource flowing exactly where it was needed at the moment it was needed. He didn't speak. Just continued walking, his jaw a tight line of something darker than frustration. Hour 7. The surgical team requested a massive transfusion protocol, type O negative, uncrossed, because they needed volume now and there was no time for compatibility testing. Natalie had already called blood bank 30 minutes earlier and asked them to start thawing. The units were in a courier bag, moving through the hospital's pneumatic tube system, arriving at the OR in 90 seconds. She heard the surgeon's voice crackling praise, good call on the anterior wall repair. That ischemia's resolving. And then silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of focus. The kind of silence where a surgical team works for 2 hours without anyone speaking because every person knows exactly what the others are doing. The silence of apex predators hunting together, each movement a dialect of perfect understanding. Natalie understood that silence in her muscles. In her hands, which moved across the coordinator's keyboard with the fluid certainty of muscle memory. The hands that had held a tourniquet on a Marine's leg while an RPG detonation carved through the compound's eastern wall. The hands that had kept 3 men breathing through an hours-long firefight while waiting for extraction. The hands that a year ago would have been holding an M16 and executing orders that no longer existed in any database. Hour 11. The surgical bleeding finally slowed. The major's coagulation numbers, which had been descending toward the abyss, started climbing back toward normal. His lactate dropped from 4.8 to 3.1 to 2.4. His pH stopped falling. The body remembers how to live when it's given enough time and enough resources and enough precision. A surgical nurse appeared at the trauma coordinator's station. Natalie recognized her from previous shifts, Sarah, competent, direct, the kind of person who understood that a well-run trauma meant less suffering downstream. Doc wants you to know he's closing now. Kid's going to make it. Natalie nodded once. Labs? Stable. Coag's finally normalized. Heart rhythm's been perfect for the last 30 minutes. The next hour belonged to closure. The surgeon stitching tissue back into alignment, the perfection of thousands of hours of training manifested in perfect sutures and careful hemostasis. The ventilator breathing for the major while his own body remembered the mechanics of respiration. The anesthesiologist monitoring, adjusting, keeping the patient in that precise margin between unconsciousness and safety. At 5:41 a.m., the surgical team wheeled the major out of the OR toward ICU recovery. Natalie watched him go through the hallway cameras, a trail of monitors and tubes, and the careful assembly of machines that would keep him breathing while his body healed. His color was better. Pink instead of the gray-white pallor of a man whose blood supply had nearly evacuated his tissues. His pressure was holding steady. His heart was beating in a rhythm that looked almost normal, almost like a body that had remembered how to live. The lead surgeon, Dr. Chen, appeared at the coordinator's station while Natalie was documenting the final hours of the surgery. He looked destroyed in the way only trauma surgeons look destroyed, exhausted past the point where sleep could fix it, hollowed out by the weight of having held someone's life in their hands and refusing to drop it. That pericardiocentesis, he said quietly. He shouldn't have survived transport. That needle bought us the margin. Whoever did that procedure knew exactly what they were doing. He didn't wait for a response. Just kept walking toward the staff area, probably toward coffee that would taste like despair and obligation. Natalie had been awake for 19 hours. Her shift had ended 2 hours ago. She stood and pulled off her gloves, then her mask, then her gown. The locker room smelled like antiseptic and sweat and the faint copper ghost of blood. She sat on the bench for 4 minutes and stared at the metal doors of her locker, at the name tag that read simply N. Hayes, RN, because anything more would be asking questions she couldn't answer. The major would live. The surgical team believed he had a chance. The coordination that Natalie had maintained for 12 hours, the anticipation, the precision of resource management, it had created the conditions where expertise could matter. Where a surgeon's skill could translate into a man breathing on his own instead of breathing through a funeral ceremony. She'd done that. And within 48 hours, the hospital administration would begin the process of making sure no one would ever know her name, much less her capability. But that was a problem for later. Right now, she just wanted to sit in her car and watch the Atlanta sunrise burn away the night, and feel, for one brief moment, like someone whose work had mattered. Monday morning broke gray and cold over Atlanta, and Dr. Marcus Whitfield sat in his office with his door closed, telephone receiver pressed against his ear like a weapon. His voice came smooth and measured, each word a precision instrument. She performed an unauthorized procedure without attending physician supervision, he said into the phone. Emergency pericardiocentesis. Without waiting for me. Without protocol. Patient endangerment, clear as day. The board member on the other end listened. Whitfield had cultivated these relationships for 8 years, careful dinners, generous donations to their children's prep schools, strategic introductions to pharmaceutical representatives who understood the value of gratitude. The chess pieces were in place. He made the second call. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each conversation identical in substance, different only in the particular anxiety button he pressed. One board member worried about regulatory scrutiny. Another feared litigation. The third was simply greedy and understood that Whitfield's elaborate billing scheme, the phantom procedures, the inflated codes, the kickbacks flowing into offshore accounts, was worth protecting. By 10 a.m., Whitfield had activated his network like a maestro conducting an orchestra he'd spent years building. For phone calls to ensure that Natalie Hayes would be isolated, discredited, and destroyed before anyone could think to verify his claims. But that wasn't enough. That was never enough. The Georgia Nursing Board received a meticulously fabricated complaint at 11:19 a.m. Tuesday morning. Whitfield had taken his time with this one, crafting each lie with surgical precision. He'd invented disciplinary reports from her previous hospitals, facilities where no one knew her name, where records were old enough to be difficult to verify quickly. Pattern of recklessness, the complaint read. Unauthorized procedures. Failure to follow chain of command. Patient safety violations dating back to her employment in Nashville. Every sentence was technically crafted to trigger investigative protocols without actually alleging anything specific enough to immediately collapse under scrutiny. But by the time anyone discovered the Nashville hospital had no such records, the damage would already be done. The board would have opened a file. Her license would be flagged. She'd spend months, years, maybe, fighting accusations she couldn't even properly refute without revealing things she was forbidden to reveal. Whitfield's final masterstroke arrived Wednesday morning in the form of an external consultant named Hartley, brought in by a board member who understood his role perfectly. Hartley wasn't here to conduct a routine protocol audit. He was here to find evidence of patient endangerment in every shift Natalie had worked. Whitfield had prepared the groundwork beautifully. He'd highlighted her assignments, noted her patient contacts, and provided Hartley with a carefully curated list of cases to examine. The consultant would find anomalies, they always did when you knew what to look for. A medication administered 30 seconds before an order was signed. A patient moved to a different bed without explicit notation. Things that meant nothing in the chaotic reality of emergency medicine but looked catastrophic on paper when a lawyer reviewed them months later. By Thursday, there would be a report. By Friday, there would be termination. By Monday, everyone at Cedar Creek would forget she'd ever existed. At 3:17 a.m. Wednesday, security badge clipped to her hip, Natalie collected the contents of her locker, folded scrubs, a half-empty container of protein powder, a photo of a medical school classmate whose name she'd never bothered to learn, and placed them into a cardboard box that had once held surgical gloves. The security officer looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Natalie." "Orders from administration." She didn't respond. She simply nodded and carried the box out through the emergency department, past the trauma bays where she'd spent the last 72 hours coordinating the most complex emergency she'd seen in 5 years, past the nurses' station where her colleagues avoided her eyes, out through the automatic doors into the pre-dawn humidity of Atlanta. The parking lot stretched empty and black before her. Her car sat where she'd left it 8 hours ago, a 2008 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles on the odometer. She placed the box on the passenger seat and sat motionless for 5 minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing. Then she drove. The diner was called Mel's and it occupied a corner lot on Peachtree Street in a part of the city where nobody asked questions. The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what she needed at 3 in the morning. Natalie sat in a booth near the back, her uniform still damp with sweat and rain, watching her reflection fracture across the dark window. The challenge coin sat on the table before her, its edges worn smooth by 3 years of constant carrying. She'd kept it in her scrub pocket through every shift, through every moment of calculated invisibility, proof that somewhere beneath the false identity lived the woman she used to be. The lieutenant colonel's voice came back to her now, as it always did in moments of crisis. His office at the Pentagon, sunlight slicing through Venetian blinds in prison bar patterns. The operation in Marja never happened, he'd said, his tone final in the way only military commands could be. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes never existed. If that name surfaces in any official capacity, if anyone knows who you are, you compromise national security. You endanger the operational capability of every person who was there. Do you understand me? She'd understood. She'd held a trauma center under fire for 36 hours after the commanding officer took shrapnel through the neck. She'd performed 17 combat saves without a functioning fore-pump, without blood products, with nothing but her hands and her training and an absolute refusal to let anyone die on her watch. The Navy had awarded her a Navy Cross. Then they'd erased her completely. Not demoted. Not discharged. Erased. A name deleted from every database, every record, every official acknowledgement that she'd ever lived. They'd given her a civilian identity, a social security number that didn't belong to her, and told her to vanish into the population and never surface. She'd been a ghost for 3 years. Now even the ghost was being hunted. The waitress refilled her coffee cup without asking. Natalie watched the dark liquid spiral into the white ceramic, watched steam rise and dissipate into the stale diner air that smelled of bacon grease and antiseptic cleaner and the particular exhaustion of the graveyard shift. She picked up the challenge coin, felt its weight settle into her palm like an old friend, like a promise, like a threat. She turned it over slowly, studying the insignia on its face, the unit designation, the year, the coordinates of the Phi base in Marja province where everything had changed. She'd held that coin the day the IED detonated and killed the commanding officer. She'd held it while dragging casualties to cover. She'd held it in her fist while coordinating air support and managing hemorrhage control and keeping 42 people alive through a 36-hour siege that nobody in the world was allowed to know had ever happened. She considered dropping it into the trash can beside the booth, erasing the last physical proof of Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Becoming entirely Natalie Hayes, the night shift nurse, the invisible woman who nobody noticed, the ghost haunting the hallways of Cedar Creek Medical. But they were destroying that identity too. By Thursday morning, Cedar Creek would have terminated her. By Friday, the Georgia Nursing Board would be investigating. By Monday, she'd be radioactive, unemployable, suspected, the kind of nurse that hospitals didn't hire because the paperwork was too complicated. She could disappear into the population. Get a new identity. Drive west. Become someone else entirely. It would be easier than fighting. Easier than enduring the investigation, the phone calls, the slow destruction of a life she'd painstakingly assembled to replace the one that had been stolen from her. She closed her fist around the coin. The metal edge bit into her palm like a brand. Back at Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Whitfield reviewed the consultant's preliminary report with satisfaction so complete it bordered on euphoria. Every invented protocol violation was there, documented and cross-referenced. He'd provided Hartley with carefully selected patient cases that, on their surface, showed Natalie making decisions without proper authorization. None of it was true. All of it would be extremely difficult to disprove. He typed an email to the hospital board with the kind of confident precision that came from knowing his power was absolute. Immediate termination recommended for patient safety. Recommend also reporting to state licensing board. He read the message once, smiled, and hit send. The email landed in the inbox of Patricia Chen, the board's chief administrator, at 5:41 a.m. She would read it when she arrived at work in 3 hours. By 7 a.m., security would have the termination paperwork printed. By 7:16 a.m., they would move to escort Natalie from the building before her next scheduled shift even began. By Friday, the state board would have opened an investigation that would take months to close and years to fully resolve. The damage was done. The strategy was flawless. The chess pieces had moved exactly as planned. But in a hospital in Fort Carson, Colorado, a major with a bandaged chest and a newly repaired pericardium lay awake in his bed, staring at the hospital ceiling, thinking about the woman who'd saved his life. He'd made phone calls from his hospital bed, the kind of calls that activated networks parallel to Whitfield's, networks that reached into Special Warfare Command, into Naval Intelligence, into the kind of offices where classified operations were discussed and decisions were made that altered the trajectory of lives. Those phone calls had triggered protocols. Those protocols had initiated contact with a 3-star general who answered directly to the Joint Chiefs. And that general had made a single decision: Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes' classification status was being reconsidered. The gag order was about to be lifted. The ghost was about to have a name again. But none of this had happened yet. Not officially. Not on paper. The paperwork moved through channels at the speed of bureaucracy, even when bureaucracy was urgent. And in the cold darkness of a diner at 3 a.m., Natalie Hayes had no way of knowing that her erasure was finally ending, that in approximately 30 hours, everything would change. For now, she simply sat in the booth with her cold coffee and her challenge coin, imagining disappearing completely. Imagining it being easier than fighting. Imagining that the ghost might choose to stay dead. She stood to leave. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her face betrayed nothing. The waitress didn't even look up as she walked past the counter toward the door. Natalie paused at the trash can and held the challenge coin over it, suspended between the life she'd been ordered to erase and the life that was erasing her. Then she closed her fist around it once more and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness of Atlanta, where her car waited and her future hung in the balance between two worlds that would never acknowledge she'd existed in either one. The rotor wash of the helicopter was still almost 30 hours away. The soldiers in their dress uniforms hadn't boarded the aircraft yet. The general hadn't made the walk through Cedar Creek's corridors. The truth was still moving through channels at the speed of classified paperwork. For now, Natalie Hayes was simply a fired nurse with a ghost's identity and a challenge coin that proved she'd been real, once, for 36 hours in a place that had never officially existed. She drove east as the sun began to rise, painting the sky shades of orange and gold that looked like fire. The rotor wash hit like a physical force. Boots on wet asphalt. A Black Hawk descended into Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot at 9:23 a.m. Thursday morning, and every person within 300 yards felt the percussion of those rotors vibrating through their sternum. The helicopter settled. Dust and diesel exhaust drifted across the emergency department windows where staff had abandoned their posts to stare. A nurse dropped a blood pressure cuff. Nobody picked it up. Two soldiers in dress uniforms emerged from the aircraft, their uniforms crisp as fresh surgical sutures, their movement synchronized and deliberate. They walked through the ER entrance like they owned the air around them, boots striking tile in perfect rhythm. Their eyes scanned the corridor. A captain and a lieutenant, both Naval Special Warfare Command by their insignia. The captain approached the nurse's station where Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood frozen, his pen still hovering over a chart he'd stopped reading the moment the helicopter's shadow crossed the windows. "We're looking for Reaper 6, the captain said. Not a question. A statement of fact. The room crystallized into silence. Reaper 6. Not a name anyone at Cedar Creek Medical had ever heard spoken aloud. Reaper 6 was a call sign. Reaper 6 belonged to classified operations in provinces where Americans weren't supposed to be, in places that officially didn't exist on military maps. Reaper 6 was a ghost. The Marine security guard who'd watched Natalie perform that pericardiocentesis 72 hours earlier stepped forward. His voice carried through the suddenly pressurized silence like a transmission being broadcast live. "You're looking for Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Naval Special Warfare Command." He said each rank and branch like he was reading scripture. The weight of those words settled on every person in the ER like a dropped anchor. Dr. Whitfield's face began draining color. His jaw clenched. His hand went to the chart and crumpled it without seeming to notice. From the hallway where the Special Forces major sat in a wheelchair, a 3-star general emerged. His uniform bore the kind of medals that had their own gravitational field. He carried a folder that looked thin but felt substantial, the way documents do when they've been classified and then suddenly aren't. He opened it and read, his voice steady and precise, the way generals speak when they're not asking for permission to say things. Master Chief Hayes is credited with 17 combat saves in Marja. Held a trauma center under fire for 36 consecutive hours. Received the Navy Cross under sealed orders. This woman has more operational experience than most surgeons will accumulate in a lifetime. He paused. The words hung like they had weight. She did her job. The major wheeled himself forward. His chest still showed the surgical scars where Natalie's hands had worked to keep him alive when his heart was drowning in its own blood. He looked directly at Whitfield with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived death. "She spent 12 hours putting my chest cavity back together," the major said quietly, using equipment meant for basic triage. "She did what 6 of your specialists said was impossible." No anger in his voice. Just fact. Just the truth spoken the way soldiers speak truth, plain, unadorned, undeniable. "She did what your hospital couldn't do." Whitfield opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His hands trembled. His face had gone the color of ash beneath fluorescent lights. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, because that's precisely what was happening. The general turned to the hospital administrator who had appeared in the corridor, drawn by the presence of three-star authority. The consultant Dr. Whitfield brought in to audit this facility's protocols, the general said, discovered 47 billing irregularities in supply orders. All traced to Dr. Whitfield's authorization codes. He nodded to one of the soldiers, who handed the administrator a second folder. Phantom procedures. Inflated billing codes. Supply orders for equipment that was never delivered. Pharmaceutical representatives paying deposits to accounts that didn't officially exist. It was the weapon Whitfield had built to destroy Natalie that turned around and destroyed him instead. The investigation he'd launched had exposed his own network like a surgeon laying bare an infection. The consultant, following federal protocols, had documented everything. The board members he'd relied on produced emails questioning his orders. They ran for cover with the speed of rats abandoning a sinking ship. Within 48 hours, federal investigators seized financial records. Offshore accounts got frozen. 2 board members gave evidence against him in exchange for immunity. The carefully constructed network that Whitfield had spent years assembling crumbled into dust and legal filings. His hand shook as security escorted him from Cedar Creek Medical, actual police this time, not just security guards. He carried a box with his desk contents. News cameras caught him leaving, his face buried, his career transforming from prestigious to infamous in the time it took a Black Hawk to land. 6 months later, a former surgical resident spotted him at a strip mall outside Atlanta. Whitfield sat at a folding table between a tax preparation service and a nail salon, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt with an insurance company logo embroidered on the breast. He was trying to sell supplemental health policies to grocery shoppers who deliberately avoided eye contact. His medical license had been revoked. His reputation had been destroyed by his own weapon. His fall was complete. But that was later. In the moment, Natalie Hayes stood in Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot as the Black Hawk's rotors began winding up again, the sound building to a crescendo like the world's largest heartbeat. The general saluted her, a crisp, precise gesture of recognition between officers. She returned the salute, her composure still intact, though something had shifted in her eyes. The thing that happened when a person was finally allowed to stop disappearing. "You're cleared for surface duty, Master Chief," the general said. "The operation's been declassified. You're allowed to exist again." The words should have meant something. The words did mean something. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, who had spent 3 years erased from every database, every record, every official acknowledgement of her own existence, was now allowed to cast a shadow again. Major Castellanos wheeled himself forward and extended his hand. His grip was firm despite his injuries. "Reaper 6. I owe you my life." She shook it. Her voice came out steady, "Just doing my job, Major." The security guard approached as the helicopter lifted away, rotor wash flattening her scrubs against her frame. "They want you back. They're offering the ER director position. Full authority over all trauma protocols." Natalie looked at the hospital entrance, at the faces pressed against the ER windows watching her, processing who she'd been all along. She held up the tarnished challenge coin, worn from 3 years of being hidden in scrub pockets, held during the darkest moments, clutched like prayer. She raised it to the morning sun and let the light catch its edge, letting herself be seen, letting herself cast a shadow again instead of living as a ghost. "I'll think about it," she said. The administrator appeared with paperwork, with apologies, with offers that should have come before she was fired but arrived exactly when they needed to. Natalie took the folder without opening it. She walked to her car slowly, processing what it meant to be allowed to be herself again. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. No longer erased. No longer classified. No longer disappearing. Inside the hospital, the nurses who had watched her be humiliated and escorted out began to whisper. They whispered her real rank. They whispered her decoration. They whispered about the pericardiocentesis and the 12 hours and the major who would have died without her. The story spread through Cedar Creek Medical like electrical current. Then to other hospitals. Then to nursing forums and military networks. A quiet night shift nurse who had been a decorated combat medic, hiding in plain sight, saving lives when nobody else could. 6 months later, Natalie worked in Cedar Creek Medical's trauma department. Her real name was on her badge now. Her rank was acknowledged. She still kept the challenge coin in her pocket. She still moved with that same precise economy of motion. But now when she walked through the hospital, she walked as herself. The timid nurse was gone. What remained was what had always been there, a warrior who had simply been waiting for permission to stop hiding. She was training new residents in emergency procedures when a first-year med student asked about the pericardiocentesis she'd performed on the major. Natalie's voice was steady and certain as she explained the technique, the timing, the physics of needle angle and pressure. She wasn't asking for their approval. She wasn't deferential. She was instructing. She was leading. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said. Remember that. The residents nodded. They were learning something that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with recognizing strength when it stands in front of you, steady and composed and absolutely certain. If you made it this far, you're witnessing proof that the most dangerous person in any room is rarely the one making noise. Subscribe to see more stories about the ones who were underestimated and came back as legends. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's talk about it.